Hello and welcome to Apostolate of the Ear, where we aim to be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. I'm your host, Sean Mitchell, and joining me today is Dr. Larry Chapp. Dr. Chapp is a retired professor of theology from St. Francis de Sales University. He is the author of, from what I can tell, 3 books. So The God of Covenant and Creation, also How Balthazar Changed My Mind with his former colleague, Dr. Rodney Hauser, and his newest book, Confessions of a Catholic Worker. And that title points to the fact that he now runs a Catholic worker farm with his wife somewhere in Pennsylvania. I'm not aware of exactly where, but
near Wilkes-Barre. Near Wilkes-Barre.
Near Wilkes-Barre. Okay, I've heard Scranton as well. I think you've got a place in that area, or you attend church there.
Well, we attend church there. Yeah, we used to have a house there, but we can't afford it anymore, so we had to get rid of it.
Gotcha. Well, I hope that was an okay introduction.
That was stellar.
Awesome. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. So I was just telling you before we kicked it off, what I'd like to do first, since this is the first episode, and thank you, Larry, for joining me for the first episode. It's I'd say a very big name for a first episode of a show. So I really appreciate it.
Well, hopefully you can go on from here to bigger and better guests. But I thank you for that. Thank you.
Well, we'll see. Well, I want to first just kind of introduce the purpose of the show. And it actually connects back, and I'll put a link in the show notes in YouTube, but it connects back to an article that I wrote. I have it right here, back in, I want to say in 2020, after the death of George Floyd. And I'm going to actually just reference something that I wrote in the article. I'm just going to quote this quickly to really to elaborate on what the purpose of this show is for me. So I wrote, quote, "I started to become very convicted about the need for the apostolate of the ear in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. May his soul rest in peace. It seemed to me that accusations of racist intention that were then being hurled at former officer Derek Chauvin were unjustified. It was abundantly clear to me that his actions were shameful, but that it necessarily followed that they were also committed with racist intention simply on account of the color of Mr. Floyd's skin was not so clear to me. Nevertheless, I had an inner sense, which I attributed to my recent consecration to St. Joseph, that I was being called to silence more so than to the voicing of my opinion. Feeling duty bound, I tried to heed that call." So that's the impetus behind the show. That was a profound experience for me because my wife, some of her friends, multiple people saw things differently at the outset in the wake of that situation. And as a result of that, I kept quiet. I listened. And for me, it was a profound experience wherein I wouldn't say I necessarily entirely changed my viewpoint in every respect, but I did begin to learn, I did some research and I looked into the prison system and how perhaps it is excessively predatory towards African Americans. And I recognized the facts on the ground may be very different from the well-crafted narrative that I have in my mind about this situation. And so anyways, it made me realize the importance of listening to be able to come to an understanding of the truth together with other persons, which actually relates really well to this first conversation that we're going to have. So what you and I are going to talk about today, Larry, is, and I don't want to stick to it too tightly, I want to make this really conversational, but an article that you wrote called Evangelization from Within, Guardini's Threshold. Right. And this conversation, actually, you might recall a phone conversation we had where I mentioned to you how I was speaking to my spiritual director. For listeners who obviously don't know, my wife no longer claims to be Catholic. And so I was speaking to my spiritual director about how to handle that, how to handle conversations around that. And I told him, I referenced the Exultet, and that was the best answer I had, how, oh, happy fall, oh, sin of Adam's pride, which gained for us so great a Redeemer. he said, that's good. I'm happy that you gave her that answer. It points to Christ. But what I want you to do is enter into her doubts. And I remember telling you that, and you said, I've written about that so much, and it just, you thought it was exactly on point. And so I don't know if it was following that or before that I wound up reading your article, Evangelization from Within Guardini's Threshold, but it points exactly to that. So let's get into that, talk about your article a little.
Sure.
So I'm going to start with reading a quote that you start with, and then I'll lead with my first question.
Sure.
Start by quoting Romano Guardini from Portrait of Melancholy. And by the way, for the listeners, this is a very old article, but I love it, and this is what we wanted to talk about. So,
and they can find it on the blog. They just have to go search for it.
Gaudium et Spes 22. I didn't mention that in the introduction.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
It says, there are those who experience profoundly the mystery of life at the threshold. They live decisively neither here nor there. They live in a no man's land. They experience the restlessness that passes from one side to the other. Melancholy is the restlessness of the man who perceives the closeness of the infinite, who experiences at the same time blessing and threat. The meaning of man consists in being a living threshold. It consists in taking on this life at the threshold and living it to the end. In this way, he is rooted in reality. He is free from the enchantments of a false intimacy with God. The attitude that is most authentically human is the one influenced by the threshold, the only adequate to reality. So I've only read a little bit of Guardini myself, not even a full work of his on the Rosary, but I thought this was a really profound quote. What it doesn't answer, but what it certainly hits at, is the first question I want to ask is just, what is Guardini's threshold? What's the here and what's the there that you're living in?
Yeah, the fact is that it's an idea that is very ancient. It goes all the way back to Plato in some ways. The Greek word that a lot of modern philosophers like to toss around is metaxis or metaxu, and it's a Greek word that means in between things, to be in between. And various philosophers and theologians down through the ages have noted that human beings are uniquely creatures who live in the metaxis, in the in-between, in the threshold, if you will, between heaven and earth. We are the strange creature that is a mixture of spirit and matter. And we have one foot in the earthly sphere, and sin makes that even more complicated. And then one foot in the heavenly sphere. And we have a foretaste of heaven, what they call a prolepsis of heaven, but we don't see it directly, as St. Paul says, we see now, through glass darkly. And so there's anguish, there's anxiety, there's doubt. And so the Christian has to, in a sense, through faith, bridge that gap, bridge that doubt. He has to live in the threshold like anybody else does, but through faith bridges this metaxis, this gap. Now, we also live not only in an in-between, a threshold between heaven and earth, but we also, and Guardini doesn't mention this, but it's true, we live on the threshold of hell as well. And we can have a foretaste of hell. And that is what our sins give us, is a foretaste of hell. We also can live in the in-between with regard to our path towards sanctity and our hope to become sanctified beings, while needing to interact both with the ongoing sinfulness of our own nature, but also the sinfulness of other human beings and their doubts and their anguish and their foretaste of heaven and hell. So it's a way of saying too that the way that a Christian lives in the in-between is to live, in a sense, vicariously through deep empathy with the other. One must enter into the doubts and the sins of the other person, to empathize with them, to try and take them into yourself. Is this not what Christ did on the cross? He took into himself the full consequences of the sin of humanity. Mystically, mysteriously, spiritually, Christ experiences the full weight of the existential consequences of sin. That began in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's sweating blood. He is so overcome with the burden of human sinfulness, but he didn't run from it. And we need to avoid theories of atonement of penal substitution that view sin as just deserving all these massive punishments, and all the torments Christ suffers just he takes all the punishment in our stead and so on. No, it's more that he experiences inwardly the full estrangement from God that our sins create. And he experiences and lives through that estrangement and comes out the other side still loving, and offers to the Father a perfect act of contrition on our behalf. So this is what we must do. I mean, the New Testament says we must participate in the cross of Christ. Christ says, take up your cross and follow me. To participate, therefore, to imitate Christ, to participate in his crucifixion means not just, oh, I offer my suffering stuff. It means that you become, as a Christian, a fundamentally other-oriented person whose entire vocation is to take in the sufferings of others and to suffer with them, for them, to suffer through them, to enter into the vicariousness of Christ's mysterious taking on of sin. So what this spells out concretely is that with, like with your wife or with people that I know, is when I was a teacher, I tried to do this. You try to understand the doubts and the pain and the anguish of the other person better than they do. To so empathize with it and think it through and pray it through and endure it, that you develop a kind of answer for it. The answer may not be completely in words in a satisfactory way, but you develop an answer. And then you can provide insights to that other person about perhaps how to come out of that doubt. So this is what Guardini's talking about. We're going to, it's in a book on melancholy. And we all are going to have the melancholy of not being in heaven yet and having a foretaste of hell as well. All right. But this is not simply a woe is me moment. That's Christian discipleship, to live in that threshold.
So there's a lot there. And I didn't want to do this on the first question, but if I'm looking to the right, it's because I'm going to take notes as we go, so I don't miss anything, and I can kind of not think about my questions as I'm trying to hear what you're saying. So one thing I want to throw out something that I found it was an interesting thought of mine, and perhaps it's just me thinking my thoughts are interesting, but I do want to get your thoughts on this. So the threshold, as you mentioned, is this living in between heaven, earth, and hell. And you say that we bridge the gap between heaven and earth through faith. So in a way, it reminds me of the saying that probably a lot of people have heard, which is, don't be so heavenly minded that you're no earthly good. But I was thinking about that, and I said, I don't think that is correct, because the logic of heaven is to descend from heaven to earth. So
That's right.
When you are heavenly minded, you descend from heaven to earth, and you go into the depths, as you say, of that other person's sufferings, so as to help them to ascend to the heavenly realm.
Yeah.
As Christ did. So
absolutely.
Thoughts there.
Well, I'm reminded, for example, within Buddhism, the goal of Buddhism is complete detachment from everything, to become so, in a sense, disinterested in everything that eventually you reach enlightenment. Because remember, the goal of Buddhism is to get rid of suffering. It said, how Gautama goes out and he sees all this suffering. He says, well, how can I eliminate suffering? Well, you eliminate suffering by eliminating all desire, and therefore, really, you eliminate the sense of the superficial self. The reason I'm saying this is, okay, nirvana is reached when you reach this state of detachment. But what of the person who reaches this state of nirvana, this state of detachment? Do they then stay in that state, or do they go back and teach others how to reach that state? And so there's a conflict within Buddhism, a tension. And the bodhisattva is one who has reached nirvana, and yet who reaches back to help others. Now, the reason why I bring this up is that within Buddhism, there's still a deep tension between nirvana and the reaching back. It is a pure act of agonistic charity on the part of the bodhisattva to lead. And in a sense, he really does have to kind of leave nirvana behind in order to go do this. Now, there's an analogy there, but it's not the same. So the point I want to make is that Christianity takes that insight and puts it on steroids and says that no, the experience of nirvana or enlightenment, or in our concept, bliss and glory in heaven, that very concept is inherently oriented towards the other. There's no tension. There's no tension. The more one enters into the bliss of heaven, the more one sees and desires that kenotic descent back down into the earth to bring others up with you. Because Christianity is not a world denying religion. Creation is ultimately good. The world is not going to be destroyed. There'll be a new heavens and a new earth. The world will be transformed, not annihilated. And everything that God has ever created will be taken up into the heavenly realm. And so, yeah, we have an obligation to, as we taste heaven, to realize, oh, I have to go back. I have to go down. I have to help others.
Hmm. Yeah, that is interesting. The tension there, I think that if I'm understanding you correctly, the tension that you're pointing out in the case of Buddhism is that to reach nirvana is to reach a state of being rid of all desire, but the one desire
Mhm.
it seems it still remains is the desire to then uh, uh, be able to kind of share that experience with the other. Is that
That's
right?
right. And that shows that the Buddhism is, and we don't want to get bogged down
Right, right.
into comparative religion, but Buddhism is a complex religion, if you can even call it a religion, or just a way, a path. But it's complex because there are forms of pure, like Zen Buddhism, that would say, no, no, you don't go back. You progress straight into nirvana, and that's it. But then there are other forms, and scholars speculate that other forms of Buddhism emerged that have the bodhisattva and so forth out of after Buddhism's encounter with other religions,
Mm,
like Christianity, for example.
mm.
And then out of that encounter with Christianity, there comes a deepening of an awareness that charity and love have some kind of a mysterious place in all of this, right?
Mm.
Uh, that we have to take into account.
Interesting. Okay, well, so that all makes sense. If we go back to your article, the way in which you started it was, and by the way, let me say for the listeners, um, anything that where we reference some other figure, it was part of the article. They're online. They've made their names known and their attitudes known and so forth. So all that said, you start by referencing a scenario where Michael Voris went on the attack against Bishop Robert Barron,
Hmm.
and it was for a well-known uh, showing of Bishop Robert Barron when he was on Ben Shapiro's Sunday Special, where Ben Shapiro asked him, "Can I, a Jew, be saved?" And he, in your words, responded tactfully and gave the church's teaching, didn't downplay the necessity of Christ for salvation, but did note how if he sincerely lives according to the dictates of conscience and so forth, yes, he can be saved. So you regard that as a perfectly orthodox answer. And so I don't think it necessarily took you by surprise that Voris would have said this, but you see it as just a completely inadequate response that Voris, as you said, went on his usual vortex tirade, literally shouting at the
Yeah.
camera, saying Bishop
Oh, yeah.
essentially should have just told him to convert to Catholicism immediately for the sake of his salvation. So we don't need to get bogged down in Michael Voris specifically, but what I want to know is, I mean, in some ways it's obvious, but what to you about that form of, actually a good word in this scenario would be proselytism, but in that
Yeah.
scenario, what is the major issue with that way of evangelizing? Why do you find it to be so problematic if it's not obvious already?
Well, God, on a multiplicity of levels. First, the deep-seated anger that was involved in the style, and one wonders how effective that would be in evangelizing any non-believer who was looking in on that, saying, "Geez, I'm interested in Catholicism, and somebody sent me this Mike Boris video on Bishop Barron and Judaism and so forth, and so I'm going to watch this." And what you see is this spittle fleck tirade of this man literally spitting at the camera in a fit of absolute rage at somebody with whom he disagrees. And I would just say, just in the level of rhetorical style, one has to take a step back and read. I can't imagine St. Paul standing at the Areopagus screaming at all the Athenians that were there about what a pile of perfidious dog do they were. And that's just not, it's just not the way to go about things. But more substantively, he just got things empirically wrong. In his mad rush to condemn Bishop Barron, he mischaracterized what it was that Bishop Barron was saying. Okay, and he does this with did this as well in his mischaracterization of the theology of Hans Urs von Balthasar with regard to dare we hope that all be saved and so on. So he's a propagandist,
Hmm.
and he doesn't mind playing fast and loose with the truth and with facts, so long as his propaganda piece gets across. He despises Robert Barron for a bunch of reasons. I don't know why. And so the point I simply make in the article is I would take, given the fact that Bishop Barron is very, very effective at what he does and successful, one could say, Bishop Barron's evangelizing style is actually quite effective. And then you look at Mike Voris and where he is now. Okay, not to go into that. I would say that his evangelizing style has not been effective. So just on the face of it, it's an absurd claim that the Voris approach to evangelization is going to work better than Robert Barron's, when Barron has established probably the greatest evangelizing media enterprise in America since Fulton Sheen.
Hmm. Yes, and so you point out later in the article, so we're kind of jumping around a little bit, but it's connected to the question of this style of evangelization. You point out two things about it. One, that it seems to have, I guess you could say, like a taste of the Enlightenment in it, right? In that it's this search for absolute certainty, and it focuses on, as you put it, these little factoids of truth that you're just hurling at the other, right? As opposed
Mm-hmm.
to, and we'll get to your approach, but a true dialogue, dialogos, where it's this submission to and penetration of the truth. And tell me a little bit about that. Is this style of evangelization in some way kind of distinctly modern?
It's very modern because what it's seeking is what we would call in philosophy epistemic certitude, epistemological certitude. It's the elimination of all mystery from the faith. It's the elimination of mystagogy. It's the elimination of mysticism. It's a desire to reduce the deep mysteries of the Christian evangel to a set of absolutely certain propositions, little truth nuggets, little factoids, and then set about very rationalistically and deductively establishing ironclad arguments in favor of these propositions. And it's very monological and it's not dialogical, and it can be very condescending. And it's very pugilistic. And as you started about proselytizing. But if you watch Bishop Barron's videos, or anybody who doesn't evangelize the way Voris does, and I'm not even certain Voris considers what he does evangelizing.
Right.
I think it's more muckraking or exposing, like he says, twirling his pen, where lies are exposed.
Right.
So I think he still views himself more as that. Remember, he should have stuck with what he was good at, which was investigative journalism in Detroit. And from that, he built his empire. He's a very good investigative journalist.
Right.
But then fame got the best of him. And so I really think that what Church Militant became and what his style became was an attempt to expose scandal everywhere. And I alone know the truth, which is why his fall lately is so great. So I'm not even certain that what he does is evangelizing at all. And it's just this monological soapboxing about various scandals in the church. Now, let's not pick on Voris. The fact is that's true of a whole host of other sort of talking heads on the internet that are also like this. Whereas Barron is very dialogical, and other evangelists, I think of Father Schmitz, who did the Bible in a year. That guy, his style is very dialogical.
Right.
This is what you have to do, and it goes back to Guardini's threshold. We're back to the beginning where You have to be able to enter into the world of the other. I know that sounds therapeutic and cliche, but it's actually deeply spiritual, deeply Christian, to vicariously suffer through, to repeat myself, what others are doing. That's the best form of evangelization. And sometimes that kind of evangelization, it takes a long time, right? Because you have to develop a relationship with people. So, I mean, even in the case of Bishop Barron, remember, Barron's been at this now, what, 15 years, 20 years? I mean, it started with just videotaping some homilies that he did in Chicago. And the fact is, the reason why he became effective was that over time, even if people never met him, just watching him speak, people got a sense of something important. And what they got a sense of was, he gets me. He understands me. He knows exactly what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling, because Barron was very good at that. And so over time, even if this is good for you to know as you start a podcast and so forth, to develop a rapport with your audience that lets them know, not that you're talking at them in a monologue, but that you're genuinely trying to understand them. And and that's why I think you're doing the right thing here in interviewing someone. That's why all of my podcasts, with just very rare exceptions, are with somebody else.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's really important.
I've watched podcasts kind of go down the drain as they become more focused on the individual who's running the whole thing, as opposed
Mhm.
to conversations. And it's sad because some of them were really good to start, and then they went down this bad path. Okay, so we now I want to move more to the positive. We've kind of we've laid out the approach of someone like Avoris, which is obviously not the path that we want to go down. And you've
Hey,
alluded
can
to,
I interrupt 1 second too? And I don't mean to do. I want to emphasize something along the lines of what we're talking about here. I don't think Michael Voris is an evil man.
right.
I think he's actually a good man. I think what he is a man who has struggled with his homosexuality his entire life, found in the church a rock of Gibraltar to orient his life around, to get out of that homosexual lifestyle, but never was quite able to, and has lived within a world of anguish and cognitive dissonance probably for 20 years now. So I hate his style and so forth, but I also pray for him because he's a fellow traveler, and I think that he is battling some very real demons. Let's just put it that way. So
Well,
I harbor no ill will towards Mike Voris. But anyway, go ahead.
well, and you also you pointed out something that in the article, and again, we don't need to focus too much more on the kind of the negative approach, but you did point out how oftentimes it's not so much the believer trying to win another person over to Christ as much as it is the believer trying to convince themselves of their own what they uh, uh,
Mhm.
claim to believe, right? And so in that sense, it actually helps you to
Yeah,
empathize with someone like a Voris,
right.
because they're the very same person who, in a way, they need to do for themselves what we're recommending to do with others, which is to allow themselves to experience their doubts and to go through that crucible of doubt to be able to come out on the other side, right?
That's right. I mean, I remember, yeah, I'm glad you reminded that I wrote that. I mean, isn't it so true, Sean? I mean, when you run across people like, I mean, the Vorises are everywhere. They're not quite as famous as Mike, but they're everywhere. And isn't it true when you listen to them, you get this overwhelming sense of the following: who are you trying to convince? Me or yourself? That's why they're
Right.
so insistent on winning the argument. I must win this argument because I think inwardly, if they feel like, oh, I lost that argument, that causes them to start to doubt, like, oh my goodness,
Right.
you know. And so I think that accounts for some of the vitriol and the pugilism and the anger, because there's a lot at stake there. I'm arguing with myself as much as I'm arguing with you, and that's
Right.
important, I think, to keep in mind.
Right. I 100% agree. And actually, I can say for certain, and I mean, you and I, you've already said it, and I'd say the same. You and I are both not perfect at this by any means, and I have certainly not been in the past, especially with it being such a difficult relationship to navigate. In that it's my wife primarily whose doubts I'm interacting with, but I do think that there is a better way, and I think that it does involve, and this is what you point out, it does involve experiencing our doubts, but not trying to convince ourselves, but trying to further investigate the truth through that process. So to move on a little bit, you point out that Voris's approach is very much a monological act, whereas, and I'm going to quote directly from your article, you say that evangelization is a relational act between persons of equal dignity who are engaged in that most human of activities, a conversation. And then you go on a little bit later in the article to, and you've kind of mentioned this as well, but to mention, to ask the question, how many people really have been won over to Christ by this more negative approach as compared to the approach of, say, a Bishop Barron or someone like him, where you say, contrast the number of people who have come to the faith because of someone like Voris with those who have come to the faith through an established and open and honest relationship or a friendship. And just as a personal note to the listeners, that's my exact experience. I am a convert to the Catholic faith from no religious background. And oddly enough, it's a very cool story. I had a high school teacher in a public school who taught a media and communications class. He said, to hell with the curriculum. We're going to talk. He told us, we're going to talk about adult matters. He said, if you want to talk about human sexuality, if you want to talk about spirituality, if you want to talk about politics, whatever you want to talk about, it's open for discussion. And he just so happened to be a very devout Catholic. And in the beginning of the class, I didn't really like him. I'm like, oh, he's kind of this fussy old conservative guy, and et cetera. But I realized two things. One, exactly what you point out is so important, that he took my doubts seriously. And two, that he knew why he believed what he believed. Even if I thought he was wrong, right, I saw that he knew why he believed what he believed. But I think the important point is, and this is your point about entering into the experience of the other, is taking the doubts of other people seriously. So tell me a little bit more about that. And if you have any, personal examples of where that's been particularly helpful for you, feel free to share.
Well, yeah, I remember when I was still, a theology professor, that it was very important to me to establish very early in my career that I established with my students, and I like what your public school teacher did, that I immediately broke that teacher-student glass barrier, right? That artificial barrier. I am Herr Professor, Doctor, and you are Herr Student. Yeah, so listen to me now, huh? No, I came in and immediately let it be very clear. Number one, I'm right about everything, and number two, I'm going to listen to everything you have to say too. In other words, you exude this sense of I know why I believe, and be very confident about it. But to be so secure and so confident in your own faith, so secure in it, so confident in your own faith, that you are then able to set it aside, to bracket it, so to speak, to bracket it, and then to engage the student or engage the other person, whoever it might be, in almost a neutral way. And what you say to them, okay, what are you thinking here? And you're not challenged by it. You're not, oh my God, what am I going to say? But because you're absolutely confident in your own, because you've already, and I this is what my students came to understand. You've already thought through every single doubt they could possibly have, and you've thought through it better than they have. Yep. And you know that you have, and that's the concept you can set. And the reason is not because you're a genius, because you've read the church fathers and you've read Aquinas, and you realize, see, one of the things that so many people today have is they have this gotcha mentality, like, oh, I'm going to come up with this question that no Catholic has ever thought of before, because Catholics are such brainwashed idiots and they're not free thinkers. And so they just run lockstep according to dogmas. So that means they haven't thought any of this stuff before, and I'm going to spring it on them. Well, of course, if you're that silly, right, there's not a doubt in the world the church fathers didn't wrestle with and so on. So if, in other words, if you're an educated Catholic in these matters, then you will have encountered these doubts, and you will have encountered the meditation, not answers to the doubts, but deep meditations on those doubts in a Gregory of Nyssa or an Augustine or an Aquinas. Now, so then the student would ask the question, oftentimes like a problem of evil, for example, why does a good God allow you? And you would be able to step back and take their question so seriously. And what I would do is I would say, okay, Joan or John or Peter, whatever, let me, if you don't mind, let me reformulate your question for you. Let me tell you what it is that I think you're really driving at here. What's your, it's an excellent question, numero uno question, but let me sharpen it for you. And I would rephrase their question for them in such a way that it became clear that I was actually making their point even better than they were making it even sharp. In other words, I was sharpening the horns upon which they were trying to skewer me. All right. And showing them that I could do this. All right. I don't want to belabor the point, run out of time, but you get the point. And then to sit down, and it might take several classes where we would go through this point and slowly think it through. You think it through with them. You don't come at them with a bevy of ready-made canned answers. Especially to a great mystery like the problem of evil. There are no canned answers. There are no answers in some sense. All right. So that's what I'm talking about, of allowing, and the only way that you can engage in that kind of pedagogy, the only way, is if you have antecedently taken seriously the question that the doubters raise, and be honest with yourself and acknowledge they have a point. Right? They
Right.
have a point, and they're human beings with a brain, and they have a point, and you need to take it seriously. And that's what makes you an authentic interlocutor, an authentic evangelizer.
Mhm.
And anyway, that's my answer.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen this done in remarkable ways in some of sometimes not just by Catholics, by Protestant
Hmm.
folks. You may have heard of Pastor Gavin Ortland. He took very
Hmm.
seriously the this theory that there's a theory that's thrown around now that we live in a simulation, and it's like that just seems silly on the face
Oh
of it.
yeah,
But we
yeah.
also, if you think about it, we live in such a digital technocratic world that people's existence becomes so intertwined with it that you could see how someone with no metaphysical grounding and just uh, kind of robust worldview might be tempted towards something like that. So even something that seems silly on the face of it should be taken seriously, because if for nothing else, in the fact that in my view, something like that can only lead to despair. So you should take it seriously in order to help to bring someone out of something like that. If
I
I could
had
really quick, go
no,
ahead.
I had students who raised that very thing because I taught a course in science and religion. So I would say, "Oh yeah, we're just living in the hologram created by aliens or whatever." So once again, I took it very seriously. And I said,
Yeah.
"Okay, but here's the deal. Here's the deal." So like Obama, here's the deal. Uh, what you're really saying is that reality as we experience it gives every impression of being something developed by a mind.
Yes.
All right, and that mind, we were getting indications that we might be in some kind of a simulation, because in our interactions with the world seems to respond as if it's recognizing that we're watching. Okay. I mean, this is the essence of quantum theory, right? That things don't collapse into position that they have until they're observed. So this is an observer oriented universe, and in the case of the whole, we're all in a hologram thing. We're in a universe created by a mind, and I'll say to the student, yeah, right. Now we're just disagreeing about who's the mind and what's the nature of the program that we're in.
That's
Okay.
That's
There you
exactly
go.
what Gavin Ortland's point was in the video that he made, is it actually lends itself to having the conversation about God if you get there. And actually, oddly enough, my wife, now she doesn't take this stuff too seriously, but she did say she thought it was very interesting. She saw some stuff about the possibility of time travel, and I'm just like, my response, it was 2 days ago, and I was embarrassed by myself because I'm like, I have this interview coming up with Dr. Chapp, and I failed that conversation the other night. I just went and I was like, listen, we live in a finite world, and I can tell you with epistemic certainty, which you just mentioned, that that what is in the future has not yet happened. So no one can enter into it if it has not yet happened. They can't move forward and enter into something that is in the confines of this finite world. And it's just, that's the way I answered it. I didn't listen to anything she had to say. I didn't, and it's just like, I don't, and
Right.
to be honest with you, I don't know where that conversation could have gone had I done that. Right. And again, she doesn't take that too seriously, but it could have gone into a larger discussion of providence, of prophecy, of whatever might be the case. Right. But I kind of failed to address that.
Or or once again, a recognition that the universe is not simply a linear progression from Big Bang to heat death, where you're born, particles are born, they bang into each other, blah, 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 you get all this stuff here. No, what it's an acknowledgement of is the absolute plasticity of time, and that what we perceive as this ironclad fixed thing called time doesn't exist. That it is a strange and mysterious reality that goes forwards and backwards. Oh, gee, what does that sound like? It sounds like almost like a description that our universe might be an expression of something that is supra temporal, beyond the temporal, that there are dimensions of existence that time is embedded within, that in a sense transcend time. Well, geez, that's what the theologians have been saying for millennia, right? That
Right.
there's an eternal realm into which temporality fits somehow. But yeah, I mean, those kinds of conversations can be endlessly interesting. And what we have to resist is the temptation of thinking, well, I better have an answer to this. Otherwise, oh, gee, I won't be able to win a soul for Christ here unless I have this answer.
Right.
Oh, geez, no, it's better to establish, and I think Aquinas hints at it, better to establish the intelligibility of the faith, and that it is intellectually cogent rather than and intellectually curious and interesting, rather than to try and fool people into thinking that we have these ready-made answers for everything. I mean, Aquinas said that one of the worst intellectual sins a Christian can commit is to make the faith simply look stupid.
Mm.
And I think in our times it is made to look stupid when it is made to look not curious, that it's not curious about anything. Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Not, I 100% agree. I think a value that is in the modern world, for good or for ill, it's here, is open-mindedness. Right. And so um, I think some of us are too stuck on the Chestertonian idea that, you only ever open the mind to close it back on something,
Hmm.
as you do with the mouth for food, right? To close it back on
Yeah.
something solid. I mean, ultimately, I think that that's true, but there's exploration before you close it back on something solid, and there's a real uh, uh, grappling with the mystery of things, uh,
Yeah.
and so forth.
I think Chesterton is at his best when he's not trying to do that kind of thing. Where he's trying to be too cute. Sometimes he's too cute.
Yeah.
An open mind is like an open mouth should eventually close on something. Yeah, that's true. But what's your point? I think he's best in like his book Orthodoxy, the chapter The Ethics of Elfland and things like that, where he's hinting at the fact that ultimately the universe is poetry and mystery and those kinds of things. And I think that's our ace in the hole.
Yeah.
The ace in the hole of the Catholic faith is its mysticism, is its world transcending supernatural orientation, and the avenues and pathways of intellect and soul and poetry that opens up. Just in other words, one of the things I like to tell people in evangelizing is the need to make sure that when we present the faith is shown to be the more expansive category. That when you're trying to ascertain the truth, Balthasar talks about, Hans somebody talks about, when you're talking about the truth of these deep and profound mysteries of existence that nobody's ever been able to answer completely, ultimately the truest answer, as people perceive it to be true, is going to be the answer that is the broadest explanatory framework. The answer that, to use the language of science, the theoretical paradigm that covers most of the data points. You might have an anomalous data point here and there that doesn't quite fit the theoretical paradigm. No scientific theoretical paradigm ever does fit all the data, not all of them. So and that's why Darwinism still remains the basic evolutionary paradigm, because there's anomalous bits that creationists can point out. What about this? What about that? And you say, yeah, but this still remains the paradigm that has the most data points within it. Likewise, in theology, you want your explanatory framework, in our case, Christ, to be the most expansive explanatory. And what you then try to show is that atheism, unbelief, materialistic reductionism, nihilism, these are very narrow explanatory frameworks. They only work if you exclude from them all kinds of data points as a priori invalid and false. So when somebody comes along and talks about religious experience or the miraculous, you come up with these David Humean-like arguments that say, oh, we're a priori just going to reject them because it's more likely that they're false than that they're true based on our experience. But that's crazy. That is an attenuated, constricted, sclerotic worldview. And this is what I think we lose sight of. This is what Barron is good in so many. What you try to do is to construct an intellectual framework that is beautiful in its explanatory inclusiveness, in its expansiveness, in its ability to incorporate ambiguity, even deeply ambiguous things.
And its ability,
anyway,
even to incorporate what, say, someone who comes from one of these other more restricted frameworks is using to defeat our perspective. So, like, for example, if someone says, well, you only believe in God because you've got some sort of, let's say it's in some way connected to the survival instinct that helps to perpetuate the species, or it's deep rooted in some psychological wound or deep psychological need, to which I would say, yes, but that's not all, right? You can incorporate that as part of the truth, but not of the whole truth. But the only way in which you can do that is not to take offense at someone, stating that as if they're taking down your entire position, but to recognize where that may well be true. Certainly, as a human being, part of the reason that I worship God is because it has a stabilizing effect in my life. Otherwise, I wouldn't do it, right? And so I think that's
it's, and oftentimes the very narrow worldviews engage in so often in these sorts of explanatory in the genetic fallacy, that you explain something that is rather ornate and complex by reducing it to its origins. Oh, that's all that is. Oh, that's all that is. And so, it may very well be that all of my, at this point, 50 years, I'm 65, my 50 years of reading theology and philosophy and all of my knowledge on these things, maybe it's just the result of the fact that I was poorly potty trained by my mother and had severe superego guilt over my naughty bits. And so developed a sexuality hang up that then developed into some sort of neurosis and now I require some sort of sadist in the sky to make me feel guilty about everything. So but maybe that's where it started. Maybe, but it certainly has progressed well beyond that. All right, and that kind of genetic fallacy thinking is because it can be turned right back on the person using it, right? As Kierkegaard pointed out a long time ago, there's also a need not to believe. One can reductively reduce atheism to poor potty training as well, only in reverse,
right.
So.
And that would be the opposite error that's sometimes made by people who take a different approach at evangelization. They almost
notice that they always claim that they have the Archimedean objectivity that they're claiming the other person doesn't have.
Right.
Newsflash, none of us have Archimedean objectivity, but that doesn't argue for a thoroughgoing relativism either.
And that brings us back to the point where we said, those people too who fail to be able to share the faith in a way that's provocative in a good way and genuinely appealing to people. And in many ways, they're unable to do that because they themselves are struggling with their own doubts. I think that is,
And I think it's also very important too to develop a proper sense of salvation, so that we don't think that the person with whom we are talking, that if I lose this argument with them and they persist in their disbelief, that they're going to hell. I think we need to dispense with that kind of thinking, root and branch, in its entirety, because I think it's toxic as all get out.
right. It's funny because that's actually, and this might be a good note to kind of end on. You have, publicly spoken about your views on, and I don't know exactly where you land, but you've publicly spoken. Let's say you have a more expansive view of salvation. We can leave it at that, and you can.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, how do you think that having that more expansive view of salvation is able to help you to sustain this more humane, dialogical, conversational, relational approach to evangelization?
I think it's absolutely key, because I don't believe that most people are going to hell, and because I don't believe that the entire eternal destiny of the person across me depends on whether or not I win this argument or win them over to Christ. I am now actually to approach them as a human being, not as a case study in an eschatological census, which I am now a part of taking, not as some sort of great game that we're engaged in, notching our belt with wins for Christ, but to actually engage this fellow human being who is a pilgrim towards the eschaton, towards the parousia, just as I am. And they're at a different place in that pilgrimage than I am. In some ways more advanced than I am, in some ways not as advanced than I am. We have to get away from this sense, this very arrogant sense of, well, I'm way up here on the path to salvation and they're back there, and now it's my duty to sort of drag them up here with me. No, 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 no. All right. The first person whose salvation you need to be concerned with in terms of hell is yourself, and to never place yourself way up there. All right. You're just a fellow traveler. And so it's really helped me to realize the eternal destiny of this person next to me is in God's hands, not mine. And Christ died for them. He died for every single sin that person standing next to me has ever committed. Okay. And they may not have faith yet. Okay. And faith is important. And I'm not saying that it isn't important. In fact, I think it's of unbelievable importance. But now what I want to do is to take someone who I'm going to presume is on their way to heaven. And that's, instead of presuming that somebody that I'm encountered is on their way to hell, I'm presuming that God's grace is such that this is a person who, like me, is on their way to heaven. That's not presumption. It's simply trusting in God's economy of salvation, his mercy. All right. And because I'm presuming that this person is on their way to heaven and is going to go through a purgative way and have to go through purgation, my interest now is getting them to see that they're on their way to heaven for the sake of their joy. St. Paul preaches, if you read his statement about the resurrection and death and original sin and so forth in Corinthians, what's very, very clear is Paul develops this theology of death and sin, where he says the reason why we sin is because we're afraid of dying and we don't think there's anything after. And one of the ways that the resurrection removes the sting of death, as Paul calls it, is because it gives us the hope of something after, that death is not the last. It removes the fear of death. So if in evangelizing another human being, I can remove from them the fear of death by getting them to accept some concept that there is a resurrection life and there is a heaven and they're on their way towards it, I can liberate them from the chains of hell that are holding them in place. Okay, I can liberate them from that prolepsis, that foretaste of hell, that threshold of hell that they're living within. They're living within. And I can bring them joy by bringing them Christ. At this point, I'm not, oh, geez, I've just saved them from hell. No, that's just not what I'm thinking at all.
Right. You're in a way, you're participating in bringing them through that purgative path that in one way or another we
Mhm.
will all pass through. And
Yeah.
I think you refer to that in the article. I took some notes beforehand, so I'm looking at it here. I think you refer to it in the article as a form of substitutionary sacrifice. You kind of took on the language
Yeah.
of, what you criticized earlier, penal substitutionary atonement, instead made it substitutionary sacrifice, where you enter into their doubts and you
Yes.
become that substitutionary sacrifice.
Yes. And my attitude towards, I want to be very clear. I believe in hell. I believe it's possible for people to go there. My attitude is that of Pope Benedict in his encyclical Spe Salve on hope,
Mhm.
salvation through hope, is, I think it's in paragraph 45, might be 48, where Pope Benedict says, the vast majority of people, very few, he says, go directly to heaven when they die.
Right.
He says the vast majority of human beings will go through purgatory and then on to heaven. And he explicitly comes out and says, and those who will actually engage in the final no to God, the final resistance to God, those who have actually made themselves into a gigantic no to God are few.
Mhm.
That's my attitude. Right? My attitude is that of Pope Benedict, that those who can, I hold open the possibility of a final no to God. And therefore, that's why I'm not a straight up universalist. Yeah, everybody goes to heaven. No, I hold out the possibility that some will be damned.
Yep.
Yes.
Interesting. Well, maybe that is a good place to end.
Okay.
But let me think if there's kind of one last question that I had for you, because there was a lot on my mind, and this interview went in directions that I didn't expect, but good ones. No, I think that's a good place to end, and I think it's a place that takes seriously judgment. So I'm
Yeah.
glad to end there. And Dr. Chapp, I appreciate you coming on and being willing to have this conversation with me, and most of all, just the conversations we've had outside of here. You just so the listeners know, Dr. Chapp is the real deal. You've been very
Oh,
great
thanks.
and had great conversations with me, and have been a lot of help. So
Yeah, you've been like a follower of my blog almost from the start. So you're one of my loyal followers. So that's great.
we got a
Oh,
quick.
look what we have here. All right.
What's up, bud? I'll be right there. Okay, just give me 1 second. Okay. All right. Well, we're gonna stop the
You
recording.
know what? I'm gonna go get some ice cream right now too, as a matter of fact. So that's funny. That's funny. All right. I hope I didn't sidetrack our conversation too much with my interruptions.